Before we dive into third grade Unit 4, I just want to situate us in the grander picture of the year. There are 6 total units in third grade, and you've just completed the first half where your focus was really on multiplication and division. You started with multiplication, and then you applied it and extended it by looking at area. When you dove into division in Unit 3, you were continually making connections back to multiplication. Hopefully, at this point, your students have a strong conceptual foundational understanding in both multiplication and division and how they're related. As you continue through units 4, 5, and 6, you will want to keep revisiting that through a center in your inclusive student activities. That way, by the end of the year, they don't just have conceptual understanding, they're also fluent in their facts. But for now, for the majority of your class, you're going to be focusing on addition and subtraction. If we take a look at the standards for Unit 4, you'll notice right away that most of them are actually additional standards. That means this content is not the most important content that you'll be teaching in third grade this year. That's part of why we pushed it toward later in the year. It's also why we are maybe not spending quite as much time on it. But we are spending a fair amount of time on it. And the reason for that is because although all of these standards are additional in third grade, they are based on standards that were major in second grade. And as we know, our students have some unfinished learning right now, especially as a result of COVID. We recognize that this is an area that you will need to support. So, for example, if we look back at second grade, fluently adding and subtracting within 100 in second grade was major work. So we recognize that you might need to build on that a little bit more before you get into third grade, where it's just considered to be additional. The other thing I want to point out is that 3 of these standards are actually not even Common Core standards. They're just Pennsylvania eligible content. Of course, we want to focus on them a little bit because they are on the PSSA, but because they're not identified nationally as the most important content, they're not included in the Common Core, we definitely don't want to spend too much time on those standards. All right, Unit 4, Topic A is really all about addition and subtraction. When you get into topic B, you focus on rounding, and then you do a lot of application with word problems. So it's a great opportunity to practice the content from topic A in an applied setting. I also want to remind you of the alignment document. I think at this point, a lot of you either use it or you don't use it. But if you have not used it, I just want to highlight that I do think it's a really helpful resource. 2 things I particularly like about it. One, it really helps you see the flow between the different pieces of the math block. So, for example, it explains to me how this opening routine helps me to get access to this formative task. That could help me to think about what sorts of questions I might ask students and what transition statement I might make. Same thing, it talks about a potential takeaway that students might have from the formative task as I head into guided instruction. Of course, I say potential because your students may have a different takeaway. The work that you highlight might go in a slightly different direction. But the point here is to show that these things were selected with some intentionality to flow from opening routine to formative task to guided instruction, inclusive student activities, and reflective closure. The other thing I want to highlight is this column right here. This is related to guided instruction. These are the key ideas that you might want to highlight as you go over a practice problem or two during guided instruction. We're just helping to focus your efforts a little bit. All right, back to our pacing guide. So you should be starting Unit 4 right at the beginning of January. You have this transitional day to do a pre-assessment. And if you can't really do much more math that day because you're doing back to classroom organization and culture building, that's fine. You can do the pre-assessment and then dive into content on Thursday. You have these 2 days built in to really get solid in place value in different ways to think about and represent numbers. If I go down to day 2, I notice that this is really building toward third grade content. It's not actually third grade content. We thought this would be something that would be helpful to help your students get access. If you don't need to do this, if you think your students already have this understanding, you could skip ahead to day 4. You'll notice that it actually refers to a second grade Envision lesson. That's because it's not third grade content, but you can pull from prior grades anytime it's helpful. I'm going to go back up to my calendar. Once you've built that foundational understanding, the way we have it laid out is that you have one day of ordering numbers, and then you have, it looks like, uh, 4 days to add, and then 5 days to subtract. If you want to do those differently, if you want to add and subtract at the same time or spend 3 days on addition and 6 days on subtraction, it's really up to you. But big picture, we gave you 4 days for addition, 5 days for subtraction. You have until roughly the 25th of January to get your students really solid on that place value, adding and subtracting. Then, toward the very end of January and the first couple weeks of February, is when you round numbers and you solve two-step problems. Again, we chunked it: addition and subtraction, multiplication and division, and then both. You don't have to chunk it that way, but you have roughly 4 days, including those report card conference days, to really think about multi-step problems. That might be a good opportunity to do 3 reads. You finish up with this Pennsylvania eligible content, but this is also content that you can be integrating throughout the unit. Notice you do have a couple of flex days coming up, so if you get behind, particularly with these report card conferences, that's how you can use those flex days. One thing that I want to highlight before we wrap up is, I got ahead of myself, the relationship between second, third, and fourth grade addition and subtraction. In second grade, students were adding and subtracting using all kinds of place value strategies within 100. So if you think about third grade, you'll notice it's really written the same, fluently adding and subtracting using all of these strategies, but now within 1,000. So the strategies that you're doing in third grade are the same ones they did in second grade, just with bigger numbers. So place value blocks, representations of place value blocks, number lines, partial sums, partial differences. Those are all great strategies. It's really not until fourth grade when the standard algorithm comes into play. All of our curricular resources do use the standard algorithm in third grade. So we're not saying absolutely not, never ever use it. What we're saying is don't jump ahead and do the standard algorithm until you're confident that your students have a solid foundation in place value strategies. And if you only do those strategies, that's great. They can do the standard algorithm next year. There's no reason to rush ahead and skip conceptual understanding. So when we think about those strategies, we're thinking about place value and partial sums. Because when I look at this standard algorithm, it looks efficient, but what the heck is this 1 up here? I don't even know. Well, I know, but do your students know? Do they understand what it means when they regroup? Do they understand that this is not a 3, it's a 300? And this isn't a 1, it's a 100. Focus on place value strategies before the standard algorithm. Another strategy I want to highlight because it often gets overlooked is number lines. Number lines are so cool, especially because they're incredibly flexible. I can add 74 plus 118 on a number line. I could start at 118 or I could start at 74. I could do hops of 2, 70, and 2, or look, I can do a hop of 120 and then back 2. It's so flexible and it's based on what makes sense to me. You'll have to pause. I'm not going to stay here too long. But here's 3 different ways that I could have added 57 plus 29 on a number line, breaking it up and chunking it the way I prefer. And subtraction number lines are so cool, especially because it helps us think about how subtraction can mean different things. Subtraction is not just takeaway. It's not just going back 49. Subtraction is also the difference between 2 numbers, and I can find that difference by counting up. The more I count up on number lines, the more efficient and honestly easier I think it is than takeaway. You might want to pause and think about these different strategies. All of them were used on a number line to solve the same problem. Big picture, you have until mid-February to finish up Unit 4. Use opportunities to revisit multiplication and division, and take this opportunity to develop students' place value understanding.